Here is a number that should have made a man immortal. 60 goals, 136 points, 76 assists, all of it in a single National Hockey League season, the winter of 1981 and 82. Only 2 players on the entire planet scored more goals that year, and their names you already know by heart: Wayne Gretzky and Mike Bossy. The man we are talking about finished 4th in the whole league in scoring, ahead of nearly every star whose face ended up on a poster, a lunchbox, a hockey card you traded as a kid. And yet, ask a room full of hockey fans to name him, and you will get silence, blank stares, maybe a shrug. A player put up one of the most explosive offensive seasons of the entire decade, and somehow he slipped straight through the cracks of the sport's collective memory. His name is Dennis Maruk. This is not a story about a man who failed, just the opposite. This is a story about a man who succeeded at the highest level the game offers, and was erased anyway, buried not by his own shortcomings, but by circumstance. The wrong team, the wrong city, the wrong era entirely. While he was filling the net, the spotlight belonged to dynasties: the Edmonton Oilers, the Montreal Canadiens, the New York Islanders, the Philadelphia Flyers. Those teams won cups, sold out buildings, dominated the highlight reels. Maruk played for a young, struggling Washington Capitals team that nobody outside the Beltway was watching. So how does a 60-goal man vanish? How does a player produce a season for the ages and end up a trivia answer instead of a legend? By the end of this story, you will understand something strange and a little sad. 3 of Dennis Maruk's hockey sticks sit inside the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. The man himself almost certainly never will. But before he was the player whose 2 biggest Capitals records still stand in Washington today, he was a 5'8" kid from Toronto that NHL scouts simply did not want. And the reason why says everything about the era he was born into. Dennis John Maruk was born on the 17th of November, 1955, in Toronto, Ontario, the beating heart of hockey country. He came from Ukrainian roots, a working-class kid in a city where the game was practically a religion. And from the very beginning, one thing followed him everywhere he went: his size. He stood 5'8". In a sport that has always prized big bodies and long reach, that number was a verdict before he ever took a shift. His teammates gave him a nickname that captured exactly how the hockey world saw him: Pee-wee. It was meant with affection, but it carried a sting. It told you that even the men who skated beside him saw the small man first and the scorer second. Maruk decided to make the world look twice. He grew a thick handlebar mustache, a Fu Manchu that drooped past the corners of his mouth, a look he picked up after watching the baseball reliever Al Hrabosky scowl his way through televised games. On a small player, it was almost a dare. It said, "Underestimate me." He played with a chip on his shoulder, all grit and speed and refusal, the way a man plays when he has spent his whole life being told he is too little to matter. And the production was undeniable. With the London Knights of the Ontario junior ranks, Maruk did not just score, he poured it on. 112 points one season, 113 the next, then a staggering 145 in his third. 3 years, 3 monster scoring lines, the kind of numbers that scream future star in any honest evaluation. But hockey in the 1970s was not always an honest evaluator. Scouts looked at that gaudy junior resume, then looked back at one figure on the page: 5'8", and they hesitated. That single number would push Dennis Maruk all the way down into the second round of the 1975 draft, and straight into the hands of one of the most doomed franchises in the history of the game. When his name was finally called in the 1975 amateur draft, it came 21st overall in the second round, and the team on the other end of the phone was the California Golden Seals. If you wanted to design a franchise built to swallow a young player's fame whole, you could hardly do better. The Seals were a financial mess and a cultural ghost, a team playing big league hockey in near total obscurity, far from the sport's heartland, barely registering on the national radar. So here is the cruel irony that would define his entire career. Dennis Maruk's curse of bad teams began on day one. He never even got a chance at a glamorous start. But on the ice, the kid they called too small went straight to work. In his rookie season of 1975 and 76, Maruk scored 30 goals and added 32 assists. Instant, legitimate production from a teenager dropped into a struggling lineup. And he did something no NHL rookie had ever done before him. He scored 5 shorthanded goals in a single season. 5. That number tells you everything about the kind of player he was. Fearless, fast, willing to attack even when his team was a man down and supposedly on defense. He did not wait for the game to come to him. He hunted it. There was one moment in that rookie year that cut against all the obscurity. His first NHL goal came in Toronto at Maple Leaf Gardens, the cathedral of the sport, in the city where he was born and raised. His family and friends were there in the stands to watch the hometown kid light the lamp on the biggest stage hockey had. For one night, the small player from a forgotten team got the homecoming a star deserves. It would not last. Just as the young scorer was finding his footing, the ground moved beneath him. The entire franchise packed up and fled across the continent to Ohio. Maruk went with the team. The Seals relocated and were reborn as the Cleveland Barons. And almost immediately, that name became shorthand for one of the shortest-lived and most troubled experiments in modern NHL history. The franchise floundered on the ice and bled money off it. Attendance was thin. The future was uncertain from the first puck drop. It was hockey played in the dark, in a city and a building that the rest of the league barely thought about. And in the middle of all that collapse, Dennis Maruk kept scoring. In 1976 and 77, he led the Barons with 78 points, the best producer on a team that had very little to celebrate. The following season, 1977 and 78, he poured in 36 goals. Picture that for a moment. A young man putting up genuine star numbers night after night for a franchise that was visibly falling apart around him, with almost no one outside Ohio paying attention. But the league itself noticed. On the 24th of January, 1978, at the Buffalo Memorial Auditorium, Dennis Maruk played in his first NHL All-Star game. He was 22 years old, in just his third season, representing a doomed team that most fans could not have found on a map. The talent was real enough to earn a place among the best in the world, even if the spotlight that should have come with it never quite followed him home. That all-star nod should have been a launching pad. Instead, it sat at the edge of disaster. Because in 1978, the unthinkable happened. His team did not simply move again. It ceased to exist, merged out of the league entirely, and Dennis Maruk's name was about to be tossed across the continent in a matter of days. What happened next was one of the strangest franchise events the NHL has ever seen. In 1978, the Cleveland Barons did not relocate, did not rebrand. They were merged directly into the Minnesota North Stars. Two teams folded into one. And in the shuffle of players and contracts, Dennis Maruk's rights landed in Minnesota. He barely had time to unpack. After just 2 games with the North Stars, Maruk was dispatched again, this time to the Washington Capitals, a young, struggling expansion club still searching for any kind of identity. Think about what that does to a man. In the space of a few years, he had been drafted by a dying team in California, dragged to Cleveland, watched his franchise dissolve entirely, suited up twice in Minnesota, and then been shipped off once more. He was not a person to these organizations so much as an asset, something to be moved, absorbed, reassigned. For a player of his talent, the lack of a stable home was almost cruel. But Maruk did what Maruk always did. He scored. Joining the Capitals just days into the 1978-79 season, he wasted no time proving his worth to a team that had precious little going for it. He led Washington in assists, he led them in points, and he tied for the team lead in goals with 31. Instant, undeniable value. The best offensive player on the roster, handed to a club that had been searching for exactly that. For the first time, it looked like Dennis Maruk might finally have found a place to plant his feet, a team where his game could grow into something lasting. But before Washington could ever see his very best, his own body would betray him, and an injury-hampered season was about to threaten to bury the story before its greatest chapter could even begin. The honeymoon in Washington was short. After that strong first season, Maruk ran into the one obstacle every undersized player dreads. His body gave out. His second year with the Capitals was hampered by injury, and suddenly the quiet questions started circulating again. The same questions that had followed him since junior. Can a 5'8" center really hold up over a full NHL grind? Was the production an illusion, propped up on a small frame that the league would eventually break down? For a player who had spent his whole life being doubted, this was the most dangerous moment of all. An injury-shortened season is exactly the kind of thing that quietly ends careers. Not with a trade or a release, but with a slow erosion of trust until a team simply stops counting on you. Maruk had already been treated as a movable asset by half the league. One more disappointing year, and he risked becoming a forgotten man before he ever had the chance to be remembered. What came next answered every doubt at once. In 1980 and 81, Dennis Maruk exploded. He scored 50 goals, becoming the first player in Washington Capitals history to reach that mark, a genuine milestone for a franchise that had been searching for a hero since its first day. He added 47 assists, finishing with 97 points and leading the entire team in scoring. A man who had spent a full season fighting his own body came roaring back as the most dangerous offensive player his club had ever produced. There was no secret to it, at least not in his own telling. Maruk's whole philosophy came down to a single stubborn idea. As he put it, "One thing I did do, played the game at 100% all the time." That was the engine behind the comeback. Not size, not flash, not the luxury of a great team around him. Just a relentless refusal to give a single shift away. The small man had answered the doubt the only way he knew how, by outworking it. And yet that 97-point season, remarkable as it was, turned out to be only the warm-up. That was the year of the Roaring '20s, the line that gave Washington a new identity. But the next season would change the cast around Maruk. And with Ryan Walter and young Chris Valentine alongside him, his production would climb even higher. That 50-goal season gave a faceless franchise something rare, an identity. It came from a line, and the line came with a nickname. Dennis Maruk centered two wingers, Bob Kelly and Jean Pronovost, and somewhere along the way, the trio picked up a name that fit them perfectly, the Roaring Twenties. It was a nod to their jersey numbers, all sitting in the 20s, but it carried a swagger that the team itself had never really had. For once, Washington had a unit that fans could point to, a piece of branded identity in a city that had given the hockey world very little to talk about. And the line lived up to the name. Together, Maruk, Kelly, and Pronovost combined for 96 goals, a staggering output from a single trio, the kind of production that drags an entire offense up with it. That season, the Capitals broke the 300-goal mark for the first time in club history. Think about what that means. A team that had spent years scraping for respectability suddenly had a high-powered attack, and the man pulling the strings down the middle was the same 5'8" player the rest of the league had once been too nervous to draft. This was Maruk at his most complete. Not just a finisher, but a creator, a center who made everyone around him more dangerous. He was lifting a franchise, almost single-handedly turning the Capitals from an afterthought into a team that could light up a scoreboard. The numbers on the board were real. The identity was real. For a brief stretch, it looked as though Washington might finally have something built to last, with Maruk at the heart of it. But the Roaring Twenties were only the launch pad. Then came 1981 and 82. 80 games that would put Dennis Maruk's name in the same sentence as Wayne Gretzky and Mike Bossy, and produce a point total that still sits at the very top of the Washington record book to this day. Now we arrive at the season this entire story orbits around. 80 games, one scoring line that almost defies belief. 60 goals, 76 assists, 136 points. Every one of those totals set a Washington Capitals single-season record at the time. And he was not finished there. Maruk also led the team with 20 power play goals, another club record. Read those figures slowly, because they are not the numbers of a complimentary player or a one-dimensional sniper. They are the numbers of a genuine superstar operating at the absolute peak of the sport. And the company he kept that year tells you everything. In the entire National Hockey League, across every dynasty and every loaded roster, only two players scored more goals than Dennis Maruk, Wayne Gretzky and Mike Bossy. Two of the most celebrated offensive forces the game has ever known. Maruk finished 4th overall in league scoring and earned his place in the All-Star game. He was, by any honest measure, one of the 4 or 5 best offensive players alive that season. Here is the part that should stop you cold. More than 4 decades later, 2 of those marks have never been beaten. His 76 assists and his 136 points still stand as the single-season records in Washington Capitals history. Alex Ovechkin later pushed past Maruk's 60-goal total with 65 in the 2007 to 2008 season, which matters because every serious hockey fan knows that number. But even Ovechkin, the greatest goal scorer of his generation, never reached Maruk's 136 points in a Capitals sweater. That is the proof of just how staggering that one winter truly was. A season like that is supposed to make a man immortal. It is supposed to be the thing they put on the banner, the thing the next generation grows up hearing about. And here is the cruelest twist of the whole story. A season that historic ended with his team watching the playoffs from home, turning Dennis Maruk into the answer to a trivia question no superstar ever wants to be. For all those goals, for all those points, the Washington Capitals missed the playoffs that spring. And so Dennis Maruk earned a distinction unlike any in the game at the time. He became the first player ever to score 60 goals in a season and not reach the postseason. It would stand as a strange, lonely footnote until Mario Lemieux pushed the same unhappy distinction even higher in 1988. And even then, the company is grim. A scoring achievement that elite attached to a team that simply was not good enough to play in April. This is the heart of how a 60-goal man slips out of the sport's memory. While Maruk was burying pucks for a club going nowhere, the spotlight belonged entirely to the dynasties. Gretzky and the Oilers were rewriting the record book in Edmonton. The Islanders were stacking championships on Long Island. Montreal carried a century of glamour, and Philadelphia brought its own loud, hungry crowds. Those teams owned the headlines and the television cameras. Washington, no matter how many goals its little center scored, was background noise. There was no national stage waiting for a player who never played a meaningful game in May. Maruk understood it better than anyone, and he never dressed it up. In his own plain words, "I never played for teams that were very good or that got a lot of coverage. Those teams never seemed to be in contention. Even the Washington teams that I had 50 and 60 goals for, they weren't very good teams." There is no bitterness in it, just a clear-eyed accounting of the truth. The numbers were his. The exposure belonged to other men, in other cities, wearing sweaters that meant something on a national scale. It is a quiet kind of tragedy, to do the work of a legend and receive the recognition of an afterthought. But for one single night, that obscurity would lift completely. The entire hockey world was about to come to Washington, and Dennis Maruk would stand at center ice for a moment he would later call the closest thing he ever had to a Stanley Cup. On the 9th of February, 1982, the entire hockey world arrived at the doorstep of a team it had spent years ignoring. The National Hockey League brought its All-Star game to the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, Washington's home barn. And standing right in the middle of it all was the little center the rest of the league had once been afraid to draft. It was a singular honor, and it remains one to this day. Dennis Maruk was the hometown selection for that game, chosen to represent the host club in front of its own fans. He stands alone in franchise history for that, the only Capital ever picked as a hometown all-star. After a career spent being shuffled from one anonymous outpost to another, the spotlight had finally come to him, on his own ice, in his own building. And then came the moment he would carry for the rest of his life. As the players were introduced, Maruk was saved for last. When his name echoed through the Capitol Center, the place came apart. He described it years later in Hockey Digest, and the memory still crackled in his voice. "The place erupted with applause, a standing ovation," he said. "It was great to see that we did have a lot of fans in Washington. It sent chills down my spine. I was so happy my mom and dad were there to see it." Picture it. The same crowd that no national broadcast cared about, roaring for the small man who had carried their team. His mother and father, the people who had watched him grow up undersized and underestimated in Toronto, sitting in the stands to see their son honored by the best in the world. For a player who never sniffed a championship, it was as close to the mountaintop as the sport would ever let him climb, and he knew exactly what it meant to him. "A lot of players are fortunate enough to play on a Stanley Cup winner," Maruk said. "I wasn't one of them. But with the reception I got from the fans that day, I consider that my Stanley Cup. That's the game I'll never forget. There is something almost unbearably honest in that. A man trading away the dream every player chases and finding peace in a single ovation instead. All-Star Week in the nation's capital carried its own glamour, too. During the festivities, Maruk joined the league's stars at a White House luncheon hosted by President Ronald Reagan. The kind of treatment usually reserved for champions, briefly extended to a player who had never won a thing. For one stretch of days in the winter of '82, Dennis Maruk was the toast of Washington. Yet even as the building shook with applause, something far less joyful was moving through the corridors. Whispers were starting to spread, talk that the team itself might be ripped out of Washington entirely. And Dennis Maruk, of all people, knew exactly what that sound meant. He had heard it twice before. The cheers had barely faded before the fear set in. Soon after that historic season, word began circulating that the Capitals could be on the move, pulled out of Washington altogether, relocated to some new city in search of money and fans. For most players, that would have been a shock. For Maruk, it was a nightmare he had already lived. In his autobiography, he wrote about that creeping dread with a weariness that says everything about the road he had traveled. Soon after the 1981-82 season, word spread that the Caps could be on the move out of Washington, he recalled. This sounded all too familiar. It was Oakland and Cleveland all over again. What I would give to play for a stable franchise. Read that last line again. What I would give to play for a stable franchise. This is the quiet wound at the center of his whole career. Not a lack of talent, not a lack of effort, but a lack of ground beneath his feet. Trace the path. He had been drafted by a doomed team in the Bay Area, dragged east to Cleveland, watched that franchise dissolve into thin air, been shuffled through Minnesota, and finally landed in Washington, only to hear, at the peak of his powers, the same rumblings of collapse he had heard at every stop before. Even a season for the record book had not bought him permanence. He had become, almost against his will, hockey's perpetual drifter, a star without a stable home. And here is the contradiction that makes it sting. While the ground was shaking under him, the team was actually getting better. In 1982 and '83, with Maruk leading the way, the Washington Capitals reached the playoffs for the first time in the franchise's history. After years of being a punchline, the club had finally crossed the threshold into respectability, and the man who had done more than anyone to drag them there was right in the middle of it. But Washington's breakthrough season came with a quiet humiliation for the man who had just rewritten its record book. The Capitals had a younger center they wanted to build around, Bobby Carpenter. So Dennis Maruk, only 1 year removed from 136 points, was moved from center to left wing. Even then, he refused to disappear. Maruk finished the season with 31 goals and 50 assists, 81 points, leading Washington in scoring as the Capitals reached the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. Then came the reward. On the 5th of July, 1983, the Washington Capitals traded Dennis Maruk back to the Minnesota North Stars. Sit with the timing of it. Just months after he had helped deliver the franchise its first taste of playoff hockey, the player who had become the face of the team's offense, its first 50-goal scorer, its record-setting points machine, the heart of the Roaring '20s, was shipped out. Not in the depths of a losing season, not as part of a teardown, but right as the Capitals were finally becoming something. He had helped build the thing, and then he was sent away before he could enjoy living in it. What waited for him in Minnesota was its own kind of insult. The North Stars slotted him in as their third-line center. Think about that drop. A man who barely a year earlier had finished fourth in the entire league in scoring, behind only Gretzky and Bossy, was now a depth player, buried below the top two lines. His minutes and his opportunities cut down to a fraction of what they had been. For a scorer of his caliber, it was a stunning demotion, the kind that quietly tells a player his best days are being filed away as history. And this is the precise moment the forgotten man's story locks into place. The player who had given Washington its identity was gone just as Washington started to matter. He would never be the face of their rise, never get to be the franchise legend who carried them out of the wilderness and stayed to be celebrated for it. Instead, his greatest work would sit there in the record book, the assists, the points, attached to a version of the team that the wider world had already stopped watching. Traded out at the exact instant relevance arrived, he was destined to be remembered, if at all, as a number rather than a name. The brilliant production that had made him a legend in Washington would never come back, and over the next 6 seasons, the forgotten 60-goal man would slowly, quietly fade toward the end of the line. The final act of Dennis Maruk's career played out almost entirely in shadow. Across his last 6 campaigns in the league, all of them with the Minnesota North Stars, he never came close to the firepower he had unleashed in Washington. The 50 and 60-goal seasons were behind him for good. What remained was the grind of a veteran role player, useful, experienced, but no longer the man pulling an entire offense behind him. The explosive scorer had become a complementary piece, his finest numbers receding further into the past with every passing year. His postseason ledger tells the same understated story. Across his whole career, Maruk reached the NHL playoffs just 4 times. There was that breakthrough run with Washington in 1983, followed by 3 trips with Minnesota in 1984, 85, and 86. His teams were eliminated in the first round, then in the conference finals, then twice in the division semifinals. He climbed as high as a conference final, but never any further. A Stanley Cup final was a stage Dennis Maruk simply never reached, which is exactly why that ovation back in Landover had meant so much to him. He retired in 1989, and even his exit carried a strange echo of where it all began. At the moment he walked away, Maruk held a peculiar distinction. He was the last active player in the entire National Hockey League who had once skated for the old Seals and Barons franchise. That troubled, doomed organization that had drafted him as a teenager, the one that moved, then merged, then vanished, finally disappeared completely from NHL rosters the day he hung up his skates. The drifter outlasted every trace of the team that started his journey. When the dust settled, the career totals were undeniable. 888 NHL games, 356 goals, 522 assists. These are the numbers of a genuinely accomplished professional, a man who scored at an elite level for the better part of a decade. And yet, the quiet manner of his fade, buried in a third-line role, far from the spotlight, on teams that never broke through, only deepened the sense that hockey was already forgetting him before he had even finished playing. Most stars drift gently into golf courses and broadcast booths when the game lets them go. But the life waiting for Dennis Maruk on the other side of hockey would take a turn so strange and so harrowing that decades later it would become the very reason he finally decided to tell his own story. When most great athletes step away from the game, the path is familiar. A broadcast booth, a coaching job, a comfortable spot inside the sport that made them. Dennis Maruk's road went somewhere else entirely. The years after his retirement, as he would later lay them out in his own memoir, read less like the story of a former all-star and more like the wanderings of a man searching for himself in the most unlikely corners of America. He took a job behind the wheel of a service ship out in the Gulf of Mexico, a long way from the roar of an arena. He carried bags as a bellhop at a hotel in Aspen, hauling luggage for guests who almost certainly had no idea the man holding their suitcases had once finished 4th in the entire league in scoring. He set up furniture for the actors Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. He worked as a farmhand for the musician John Oates. Each of those jobs is an ordinary life. Stacked together, attached to a man who had buried 60 goals in a single season, they form one of the strangest post-career stretches in modern hockey. There is no dressing this up as glamour. This was a scorer who had stood at center ice while an entire building chanted for him, now anonymous, drifting through work that had nothing to do with the game he had given his body to. If you ever wanted a literal portrait of the word forgotten, it was Dennis Maruk setting up someone else's furniture, far from any rink, with no one around him aware of what he had once been. And the journey grew darker still. In his autobiography, Maruk describes reaching what the book presents as a critical turning point during a trip to the Grand Canyon. He does not lay out the particulars for the reader to pick apart, and neither will we. What matters for this story is that by his own telling, it was a moment when he understood how far he had drifted from the life he once knew. That a man who had scored at the very top of his profession could reach that kind of private crisis tells you how complete his fall from the spotlight had been. And then, nearly a decade after he had hung up his skates, his name reappeared in professional hockey box scores in the unlikeliest place in America, deep in the bayous of Louisiana. Roughly 10 years after he had walked away from the game, something turned up on a minor league stat sheet that must have made anyone who recognized the name do a double take. Dennis Maruk, suiting up for the Lake Charles Ice Pirates of the Western Professional Hockey League. 8 games, 2 assists. It was not a comeback, and he never pretended it was. By his own reasoning, he was simply filling in because the team had run short on bodies and needed warm legs through a stretch of injuries. There was no grand return, no chase after lost glory, just a former NHL scorer quietly lacing up to help out a club in a low-level league in southwest Louisiana. Picture the distance traveled. From 60 goals and a standing ovation at an all-star game to 2 helpers in 8 scattered appearances in the Bayou country. That gap, more than any record or trophy, captures the full arc of his story. But Louisiana turned out to be more than a footnote. It became the place where Dennis Maruk rebuilt a life. He and his wife Kim opened an antique store there. The same hands that had once cradled a stick through a record-setting winter, now arranging old furniture and curiosities for customers who may never have known their shopkeeper's history. And he did not abandon the game entirely. He put energy into developing local hockey programs, helping plant the sport in unlikely soil, far from the frozen ponds of his Ontario boyhood. There is a real dignity in this chapter, and it cuts against everything the word forgotten usually implies. Here was a man who had every reason to be bitter, traded away from the team he built, faded into anonymous jobs, never given his due, and instead, he reinvented himself with quiet humility. The all-star ovation and the antique shop counter belong to the same person. So do the 60 goals and the 2 assists in Lake Charles. It is a portrait of a man simply getting on with living, far from the hockey world that had moved past him. By the year 2017, the man hockey had largely forgotten finally decided to tell his own story, and the title he chose was perhaps the bluntest admission of his entire career. The book arrived in 2017, co-authored with the sports journalist Ken Reed and published by ECW Press. Its title did not flinch from the truth at the center of everything. It called him hockey's forgotten 60-goal man. There is something almost defiant in choosing those words for your own memoir, taking the very thing that had erased you and stamping it on the cover. The foreword was written by Marcel Dion, another undersized scoring star who understood exactly what it meant to produce extraordinary numbers without always receiving the mythology reserved for champions. The memoir was a reckoning, a chance for a man long overlooked to finally set down the full sweep of his journey, from the undersized kid in Toronto to the record-setting scorer, to the wanderer who had drifted through service ships and antique shops. After decades of being a trivia answer, Dennis Maruk got to be the narrator of his own life. And yet, the deepest irony of his career was waiting inside one building in his hometown. Dennis Maruk is not a member of the Hockey Hall of Fame. He almost certainly never will be. But walk through that hall in Toronto, and you will find 3 of his sticks resting there. An All-Star Game stick, the stick he used to score his 351st career goal, and the very stick he used to fire home his 60th goal in that historic season. Sit with that contradiction. His artifacts are enshrined among the immortals of the sport. The man who wielded them is not. The tools of his greatness are preserved behind glass, while his name remains a stranger to most of the people who pass by. In the years that followed, he did slip back toward the game's embrace in small ways, appearing at Capitals alumni events where the franchise he had helped lift remembered the player who once carried it, and serving for a time as a motivational speaker, turning his unlikely path into a story worth standing up and telling. Piece by piece, the forgotten name was being reclaimed, even if it was happening quietly. So how should hockey remember a man whose 2 greatest Capitals marks still stand, whose sticks sit in the hall, and whose name still barely registers? And what does his story really tell us about the way greatness gets erased? Here is the verdict, and it is a strange one. By every measure that should matter, Dennis Maruk was a great offensive player. His 76 assists and his 136 points remain the standard no Washington Capital has ever surpassed. More than 4 decades on, through generations of stars who wore that sweater after him. Those marks did not survive by luck. They survived because the season behind them was quite simply extraordinary. So, what? Greatness, it turns out, is not enough on its own. The sport remembers winners and dynasties and championship moments, and a player who scored brilliantly for clubs that never broke through can do everything right and still slip out of the collective memory. Maruk's whole career is proof that the spotlight chases the banner, not always the talent. And yet, he made his peace with it in a way that lingers. He never lifted a Stanley Cup, but on one night in Landover, with his mother and father watching, an entire arena rose to roar his name, and he decided that ovation would be his championship. "I consider that my Stanley Cup," he said. "That's the game I'll never forget." There is more grace in that single line than in many a Hall of Fame speech. Dennis Maruk is the reminder every fan of this sport should carry. Behind the celebrated names and the dynasties everyone remembers, there are men who did the work of legends and received the recognition of strangers. The little center from Toronto, the one they called Pee-wee, the one the scouts were afraid to draft, he scored 60 goals in a single winter and gave everything he had, 100% of it, every shift. The next time someone runs through the great scores of the early 1980s, do the game a small justice. Remember the name Dennis Maruk.